Hi everyone. The city is overcrowded, and I'm one of the people overcrowding it. If I had your idea, I'd leave the city, but it holds me. I'm only a musician, and a bad one at that. A hack writer, smearing the pages of the sensation with blood and grime. Lights shone in the streets, and long cars began to steal effortlessly through the night, freed at last from the traffic restrictions. The city was gradually recovering from its shock, exerting its everlasting magic. That's from People of the City by Cyprian Ekwensi, an astonishing debut novel published in 1954, and just a work that brims with vitality and life. A work in which the city seems to be alive, but the people of the city are so much more alive. And the city itself is never named in the book, but is so clearly Lagos, Nigeria. The lagoon is a huge giveaway. The Yoruba accents that are employed are huge giveaways. But the book is fascinating. It doesn't seem to be a product of the 1950s. The energy of the book, it either feels like it should be in the 1920s or in the 1980s, because everything just moves so quickly across the pages. Characters introduced, and they pass through very, very quickly. There are quick interactions, and then suddenly we're moving forward again. It feels analogous almost to some of the ways directors like Jean-Luc Godard or Martin Scorsese would cut their films, to just edit them so that we're constantly moving forward. And there's time for meditation, there's time for reflection, but as characters pause for reflection, the world around them is moving, and it continues to shift. And so this is a book that I read last weekend, and I absolutely enjoyed it. There are aspects of it that are very difficult when reading. There's violence that's present. And it's violence that involves both men and women, in one incident a child. And it's usually not graphic, but it happens. It happens suddenly. There's not necessarily a warning, and it occurs. Just as in real life, there's not often a warning when there's a car accident. It happens. And so the People of the City really captures that. It's written so clearly by a young writer. He's just constantly wanting to move the narrative forward, move his characters forward, and just explore life, explore the bounds of the novel. Sometimes there are novels, I think, where we get a writer who wants to take the characters, and I've used this analogy before, but take the characters, stick them in an aquarium, and then they can't go beyond the walls of that aquarium. That's the little, box that everything's going to happen in, the whole plot's going to occur in. And a book like People of the City, a book like Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, the characters seem to break free of those bounds. They seem to have their own agencies, their own desires, and the writer allows the characters to breathe and to try and push forward and explore the space they can occupy. And so that happens in this book. We take sudden trips to different parts of Nigeria. Decolonization is underway. Elections are a quick part of this. That the bad musician, Amusa Sango, who's also a crime writer, what a great combination of jobs. He and his band at one point they're employed to go drum up, and play campaign songs as the election's going on. So there's constant energy, there's constant movement across the book, and it's one that I really enjoyed. Another, the senses of the reader are filled when reading this book. There comes the dreaded city noise of Musa. You live with it so you don't notice it anymore. Sounds of buses, hawkers, locomotives, the grinding of brakes, the clanging of church and school bells. The city was awakening. When Sango first moved into 20 Malomo, the faintest noise would bring him racing to the street, and he would get there to find the crowd pressing on the central characters. Once he had seen a husband dragging his wife by her hair because he had never found out why. All the answers he got were in Yoruba, and Sango did not speak the language. Now the scenes had lost their novelty, and whatever he missed he could always pick up at the barber's shop. The noise grew louder. Something was happening. This noise had a hysterical urgency that frightened Sango. Even the cars were checking, and now the yelling was rising above the hum of the engines. He decided to remain where he was and finish the report. But he doesn't. Someone knocks on the door, and suddenly he's plunged into what is happening out there in the street. We see what's going on with characters. Not necessarily the poverty, but the knife edge that characters could live on in 1940s or 1950s Lagos, and in many cities today, where a landlord can toss someone out. Someone makes too much noise, that's it. Someone uses the rented apartment to try and like pass off fake penicillin. The person who's renting the apartment isn't even there. That person could, be evicted. And so how quickly life can be unsettled and unbalanced is present constantly throughout the book. And it really just does have this energy. But there's also times where Ekwensi really does appreciate the beauty of his home, the beauty of the people who live there. Sango had not noticed the moon till he saw the shadows of the coconut fronds waving against the sky. The surf beat with violence, and the courting couples were dark clumps on the sand. There was a faint breeze with a tang in it. And so I want to be there. I want to find this beach. I want to see the clumps of seductive couples. There's no passage in here, as brutal as some of the scenes are, as suddenly violent as some of the scenes can be. Every page feels absolutely compelling and feels so authentic. And it really is a hallmark of this book. And it's not something that was necessarily true for everything Ekwensi wrote. As he developed as a key voice, the voice of an African writer, a Nigerian writer, and he really owned that. He kept publishing. He gradually becomes more and more instructive in his books. But People of the City just brims with life, with his life, with the lives of those he saw, those he spent time with, those he loved. And it really is a marvelous short book and a great introduction into modern African literature, one I highly, highly recommend. I'm so glad NYRB Classics did decide to reprint this. There's the great Heinemann African Writers series, there's a great Longman African Writers series, but NYRB has a certain cachet, and so it's great to see a book like this pushing out. Now, some other books that, of course, I'm reminded of would include Wole Soyinka's Achebe, The Years of Childhood. This is set roughly about 10 years, I want to say, before People of the City. It's sort of written later on, but the setting is a little bit earlier and explores life sort of in a more rural setting, as many of the same events are occurring. In terms of the energy, just the absolute energy, nonstop, the ways that characters are so filled with passion for each other. Claude McKay's Romance in Marseille, just published very recently, despite being written in the 1930s by Penguin Classics. This is another book that comes to mind and a really wonderful book to read. I don't think it's possible to mention People of the City without mentioning the book published a few years later, Things Fall Apart, and a book that feels much more didactic than People of the City, and yet still feels just as alive, just as passionate, just as furious. Not a Nigerian writer, but someone writing roughly a generation later, and instead of having the focus be on what's happening in Africa, more on the experience of the African diaspora, would be the great Our Sister Killjoy by Amata Edu. And this is from the Longman African Writers series that I had referenced. I mentioned, of course, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, a book that, while the stream of consciousness is not present, the way that Ekwensi likes to shift from character to character. Musa Sango we're in his mind for a solid 67% of the book, but that other third is really fascinating when we see his landlord, when we see his friends, when we see some of the women in the book and their experiences. It's sudden, it's abrupt, and yet it still feels totally compelling. But then there are so many books that I feel represent the energy of the book. As I mentioned, it feels like it could have been written either the 20s, I'm thinking like the Roaring 20s of F. Scott Fitzgerald, or the 80s. I was reminded a few times of the pace of Bright Lights Big City by J. McInerney. It's much darker than anything by Wodehouse, but some of the schemes that various characters employ feel like the types of schemes we run across in the Jeeves and Wooster novels, except with a body count, with a totality to it. And I was also reminded, thinking of the way the city is portrayed, the way that experience is portrayed in the city, I thought of Dickens. And I was trying to think of which Dickens novel. It would probably be Hard Times, Maybe Oliver Twist, not necessarily the larger Dickens works, but the way that so many characters just have personalities. There's a character whose name we never learn. He's constantly referred to simply as First Trumpet because that's his position in the nightclub band that Sango is part of. But he has a whole personality. We know who he is. We just don't know his name. In terms of I was reminded as well of Cinderella Liberty by Darryl Ponicsan. This is a really interesting book about a sailor who can only get leave. He has to return every night to the hospital at midnight, and so he tries to have this whole life and have a relationship, become sort of a surrogate father, get a job, when he can have that leave in the evenings, and he has to return every night. And so there's a certain pace, there's a sadness to that story as well. Some of the great Harlem Renaissance poems and stories, I think, reflect the energy of people of the city. And then I was trying to think of other city works. Maybe The Assistant by Bernard Malamud. The feeling is not the same. The tone is utterly different. But that sense of a city, that sense of community that can exist on one street in a city, it was very present. And then for those who are interested by the city of Lagos, Lagos Noir is a very, very good volume with about a dozen stories set in different parts of the city. A very large and mega city, true mega city. So let me know if you've read this or if you have other African writers you recommend. But this is one that I think is a true classic. So thanks, everybody.